From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Make no mistake, President Trump is an accomplice to terrorism. After his pathetic reaction to Charlottesville, KKK neo-Nazis jumped up and down with joy. If that's not being an accomplice to terrorism, I don't know what is.
Stephen Goldstein, executive director of the Anne Frank Center for Mutual Respect, is calling on Twitter to suspend President Trump's personal account as Trump continues to face outrage over his response to last weekend's deadly white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. Then part two of our discussion with former neo-Nazi Christian Picciolini, co-founder of Life After Hate.
We decided at that point, 30 years ago, that we were not going to shave our heads. We were going to trade in our boots for suits. We were going to go enroll in college and recruit on campuses. We would get jobs in law enforcement, go into the military to get training and to be able to recruit there, and then even run for office. And here we are 30 years later with that dream or that nightmare realized.
And we speak with Jacob Scott in Fargo, North Dakota, the nephew of a white supremacist who marched in Charlottesville protest.
He and lots of Nazis think that they're fighting against the establishment, but racism is the establishment, you know? I mean, capitalism is built on racism from the ground up. And so when you have this worldview that kind of looks at everything upside down and backwards, I don't know how to reach him and how to prevent him from doing the things that he says he's going to do.
Then the surveillance state. The Justice Department's demanding 1.3 million IP addresses of people who visited the Disrupt J20 website, which was used to organize the protests against President Trump's inauguration. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Barcelona, Spain, 14 people have died after a van plowed into a crowded walkway Thursday along Las Ramblas, the city's most famous avenue. More than 100 people were injured. Eyewitnesses describe scenes of horror.
People were scared, running all over the place. There was blood on their faces. It was terrible.
It's an attack, my friends, an attack in the middle of Las Ramblas of Barcelona. There are lots of dead people along Las Ramblas. It's really awful. Even kids, mothers, and little kids dead in the middle of Las Ramblas.
The self-proclaimed Islamic State claimed responsibility. In the hours after the attack, Spanish police shot 5 people dead during what they described as an anti-terrorism operation in Cambrils, a town south of Barcelona on the sea. Police said the men were linked to the Barcelona attack but provided little information. The Spanish Prime Minister, Mariano Rajoy, has declared 3 days of mourning. Earlier, thousands of people filled the streets of Barcelona chanting, "We are not afraid." President Trump responded to the attack in Barcelona by writing on Twitter, quote, "Study what General Pershing of the United States did to terrorists when caught. There was no more radical Islamic terror for 35 years. Trump was referring to a debunked myth that U.S. General John Pershing executed Muslim rebels in the Philippines in the early 1900s by shooting them with bullets dipped in pig's blood. Trump made reference to the same made-up story last year on the campaign trail.
He took 50 bullets and he dipped them in pig's blood. And he had his men load his rifles and he lined up the 50 people and they shot 49 of those people. And the 50th person, he said, "You go back to your people and you tell them what happened." And for 25 years, there wasn't a problem. Okay? 25 years, there wasn't a problem.
Historians say no evidence exists that this ever happened, while Trump condemned the terror attack in Spain as soon after it occurred. He still refused to describe 2 recent events in the United States as domestic terrorism, the bombing of Minnesota's largest mosque and Saturday's white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, where a neo-Nazi drove his car into a crowd of anti-racist protesters, killing 1 woman and injuring 19 people. This all comes as President Trump faces growing criticism from across the political spectrum. On Thursday, Republican Senator Bob Corker of Tennessee openly questioned Trump's stability and competence.
The president has not yet been able to demonstrate the stability nor some of the competence that he needs to demonstrate in order to be successful.
Meanwhile, Democratic Congressman Steve Cohen of Tennessee has announced plans to introduce articles of impeachment against President Trump. And James Murdoch, the son of Rupert Murdoch, has condemned President Trump's reaction to Charlottesville. Murdoch wrote, quote, "I can't even believe I have to write this. Standing up to Nazis is essential. There are no good Nazis or Klansmen or terrorists," he wrote. Murdoch, who is the CEO of 21st Century Fox, also pledged to donate $1 million to the Anti-Defamation League. Murdoch is a close, informal advisor to President Trump. In Durham, North Carolina, a total of 8 people have now been charged with toppling a Confederate statue. On Thursday, in a display of solidarity, over 100 people lined up outside the local courthouse to symbolically turn themselves in, along with the 8 people charged. In other news from Durham, a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee at Duke University has been vandalized. Parts of Lee's face was chipped off, including his nose. Meanwhile, President Trump has weighed in again on the growing call for Confederate statues to be removed. On Twitter, he wrote, "Sad to see the history and culture of our great country being ripped apart with the removal of our beautiful statues and monuments." Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, more than 2,000 people took part in a march Thursday denouncing racism and President Trump's handling of Charlottesville. Many participants also called for the removal of a statue of former Philadelphia Police Commissioner and Mayor Frank Rizzo. In other fallout from Saturday's white supremacist march in Charlottesville, the American Civil Liberties Union has announced it will no longer defend hate groups seeking to march with firearms. The ACLU has faced criticism, even from many of its own members, for helping organizers of the Unite the Right rally to secure a protest permit after the city of Charlottesville tried to block the rally. Earlier in the week, Waldo Jacquet, a board member of the Virginia chapter of the ACLU, resigned after the deadly violence in Charlottesville. In international news, the United States and South Korea have announced plans to go ahead with a massive joint military drill next week involving tens of thousands of troops. This comes despite protests from China, which has pushed for the U.S. to halt its military drills in exchange for North Korea halting its missile tests. In news from Syria, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights is reporting at least 59 civilians have died in U.S.-led airstrikes in the city of Raqqa since Monday. The dead include 21 children. According to the United Nations, 25,000 civilians remain trapped inside Raqqa, the de facto capital of the self-proclaimed Islamic State. In news from Hong Kong, 3 student leaders of the pro-democracy Occupy movement have been sentenced up to 8 months in jail for organizing large protests in 2014, calling on China to allow free elections in Hong Kong. Joshua Wong is one of the student leaders heading to prison.
We are still optimistic with our faith and love to our hometown. I still believe that time is on our side, and one day Hong Kong will be a place that we can determine our own future. If the one who need to send to prison don't give up, I believe there's no reason for anyone that are not in prison to give up or step backward. Keep on to fight. We love Hong Kong. Thank you.
A settlement has been reached in a landmark torture lawsuit against 2 psychologists who helped devise the Bush administration's interrogation program. The psychologists, James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen, were sued by the American Civil Liberties Union on behalf of 2 former CIA prisoners who were tortured and the family of a man who died after being tortured in a secret CIA prison. The undisclosed settlement was reached just before the case went to trial. ACLU attorney Dror Ladin said, quote, "This outcome shows that there are consequences for torture and that survivors can and will hold those responsible for torture accountable." In voting rights news, the state of Texas has been ordered to redraw the map of its congressional districts after a federal court determined some of the districts were designed to dilute the power of Latino and African-American voters. The maps were drawn by Texas's Republican-led state legislature. Mother Jones reports this is the 7th time since 2011 a federal court has found Texas intentionally discriminated against voters of color. In news from Florida, 2 members of the Ku Klux Klan who worked as prison guards have been convicted of plotting to kill an African-American prisoner after his release. Earlier this week, a jury in Columbia County, Florida, found David Elliott Moran and Charles Thomas Newcomb guilty of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. A 3rd Klansman, who also worked as a prison guard, pleaded guilty earlier this year. ExxonMobil has won a major court case over its role in the 2013 pipeline spill in Arkansas, where more than 200,000 gallons of tar sands oil flowed through a residential neighborhood of Mayflower, Arkansas, and nearby waterways. U.S. pipeline regulators had fined Exxon $2.6 million and ordered the company to revise its pipeline safety procedures. But now a federal appeals court has sided with Exxon, overturning much of the regulator's decision. In sports news, an image is going viral today of a white football player putting his arm around an African-American teammate who put his fist up in the air during the national anthem. Malcolm Jenkins of the Philadelphia Eagles has been raising his fist during the anthem for the past year. On Thursday, his teammate, Chris Long, who is from Charlottesville, put his arm around him in a sign of solidarity. Meanwhile, in other sports news, basketball superstar Kevin Durant has said he will not go to the White House if Trump invites the NBA champion Golden State Warriors. Durant said, quote, "I don't respect who's in office right now." And in Puerto Rico, resistance to the dumping of toxic coal ash in the southern town of Peñuelas is spreading across the island. In the capital, San Juan, activists wearing hazmat suits poured buckets of coal ash on the steps of the Capitol building Thursday morning in protest.
The government of Puerto Rico is creating a health problem, an environmental problem, and a problem for the future and the coming generations. We want Puerto Rico to close the coal-fired power plant. The only ashes that we want are those of the Fiscal Control Board.
Morning, over 100 police officers, including a militarized strike force, mobilized to stop residents of Guayama from blockading trucks carrying toxic ash as they left the coal-fired power plant en route to Peñuelas. This is community leader Hector Luis Sanchez de Jesus.
Estamos impidiendo
We are impeding in whatever manner is possible that these ashes produced here in Guayama depart for Peñuela. We understand that these ashes are poisonous for the earth, our Mother Earth, and for the health of all the residents of Puerto Rico. We have a moral compromise with our friends in Peñuela to stop these ashes from being transported there.
Less than an hour later, 200 more police officers mobilized in Peñuelas to stop residents from blockading the trucks as they arrived to dump the coal ash there. At least 25 activists have been arrested blockading the trucks so far this month. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump continues to face outrage over his response to last weekend's deadly white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, where racism and anti-Semitism were on clear display in scenes like this one, when torch-bearing protesters marched on the University of Virginia campus Friday night, chanting "blood and soil," a phrase drawn from Nazi ideology. Saturday's Unite the Right rally, neo-Nazis and Ku Klux Klan members also displayed swastikas on flags and banners as they protested the removal of a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. Members of the local synagogue, Congregation Beth Israel, said that ahead of the protest, while they were praying, men dressed in fatigues and carrying semi-automatic rifles stood across the street from the synagogue, prompting people to leave the service from the back of the building in groups as a safety precaution. Later in the afternoon, Heather Heyer was killed on Saturday when a 20-year-old Nazi sympathizer named James Alex Fields plowed his car into a crowd of anti-fascist demonstrators. In another incident, white supremacists beat 20-year-old African-American protester DeAndre Harris. Following the protests Monday, the New England Holocaust Memorial was vandalized in Boston, Massachusetts, by a teenager who threw a rock through a glass panel etched with numbers symbolizing the numbers tattooed on the arms of Jews and other imprisoned in Nazi Germany's concentration camps. The attack marked the second time this summer that Boston's Holocaust Memorial has been vandalized. It took until Tuesday for President Trump to place blame on white supremacists for the deadly violence in Charlottesville. During a news conference at Trump Tower, he attacked the counter-protesters, repeating his earlier claim that both sides were to blame for the violence. He seemed to ridicule the national movement to remove Confederate monuments, saying the protesters would next want to tear down statues of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Trump also defended some of the white nationalist protesters who descended on Charlottesville.
I've condemned neo-Nazis. I've condemned many different groups, but not all of those people were neo-Nazis, believe me. Not all of those people were white supremacists by any stretch. Those people were also there because they wanted to protest the taking down of a statue, Robert E. Lee.
On Thursday, President Trump took to Twitter to further complain that it's, quote, sad to see the history and culture of our great country being ripped apart with the removal of our beautiful statues and monuments. The beauty that is being taken out of our cities, towns, and parks will be greatly missed and never able to be comparably replaced, he tweeted. Leaders of 4 congressional caucuses are now demanding the White House fire senior aides Sebastian Gorka, Steve Bannon, Stephen Miller over their white supremacist views. In a letter to President Trump, the Congressional Asian Pacific American, Hispanic, Progressive, and Black caucuses wrote, quote, "We're deeply concerned their continued influence on U.S. policy emboldens and tacitly approves the ideological extremism that leads white supremacists to spread violence and hatred." Now the Anne Frank Center for Mutual Respect is calling on Twitter to suspend President Trump's personal account after branding him an accomplice to domestic terrorism. For more, we're joined by the group's executive director, Steve Goldstein, executive director of the Anne Frank Center for Mutual Respect. Welcome to Democracy Now! Explain what you're calling for.
Amy, Twitter has a choice here. It can stand with the love that Heather Heyer's life stood for, or it can stand for the hatred that Donald Trump stands for. There are no two sides. Where is Twitter going to stand? Twitter is under no obligation as a private company to carry Donald Trump's hatred. So President Trump has 2 accounts. He has his POTUS account, and for the sake of free speech and getting his hate on record for future generations to look at it and to say never again, listen, for those reasons, keep his presidential account. But he has a personal account, Real Donald Trump, that amplifies his hate. Twitter doesn't have to double down on hate. Twitter has a choice. Get rid of the Real Donald Trump hatred account. Not much better than the POTUS account. At least get rid of one.
Are you concerned about issues of free speech here?
Well, again, he has his POTUS account. Free speech doesn't mean that you have to give hate twice the megaphone when he already has 1 megaphone. That seems to us a Solomonic solution.
Talk about his response. On Monday, teleprompter news, he makes a teleprompter statement, some called it a hostage video, where he condemned and named the Ku Klux Klan, the white supremacists, the neo-Nazis. This directly contradicting what he had said 2 days before when he said that all sides were responsible for the violence, and then the next day, on Tuesday, reverting back to what he said on Saturday, and particularly focusing on the fact that the white supremacists had a permit for their protest, unlike the counter-protesters.
Well, Amy, I was horrified on Monday by the coverage of the mainstream media that applauded the president for his hostage news conference, in which he read a teleprompter with all the energy of a power outage in New York City. He didn't look like he meant every word, any word. He looked like there was a figurative gun to his head. He didn't want to be there. And when I read the media reports, they said, aha, the president finally came out. You've got to be kidding. The president said nothing after Charlottesville. Finally, he was forced to. Have we so normalized hate that that Monday press conference that was scripted should get applause?
Not even a press conference, a statement.
Not even a press conference. But what kind of world has America landed in? Where is our morality that we are settling for the crumbs of a fake condemnation? Now,
well, we learned it was fake on Tuesday.
And we learned it was fake on Tuesday. Here's the thing. It's time not to limit ourselves to saying that President Trump commits acts of racism, sexism, Islamophobia. anti-Semitism, anti-LGBT. The president is a racist, the president is Islamophobic, and the president is anti-Semitic. Call it out for what it is, because if you don't, you're normalizing the underlying conditions. Now, why would I say that? We've seen again and again a pattern. How many times do we have to see that if a president quacks like a racist duck, walks like a racist duck, and does everything in his power to be a racist duck, he is a racist duck?
What does this have to do with Anne Frank? You're executive director of the Anne Frank Center.
So let me say this. There are those not in your audience who would say, Stephen, aren't you coming on a little too strong for the Anne Frank Center? No. Anne Frank did not just write her diary as her own personal experience, which she included. She also wrote it as one of social justice's greatest exhortations. She wrote that we have to act to prevent never again. So, Amy, never again is supposed to be an early warning system. If we don't shout this danger from the rooftops, when will we? When history has taken its worst stages of progression, that's when we're going to shout it from the rooftops? Please.
Meanwhile, leaders, let me turn to leaders of 4 congressional caucuses demanding the White House fire senior aides Sebastian Gorka, Steve Bannon, Stephen Miller over their white supremacist views. In a letter to President Trump, the Congressional Asia-Pacific American, Hispanic, Progressive, and Black caucuses wrote, "We are deeply concerned their continued influence on U.S. policy emboldens and tacitly approves the ideological extremism that leads white supremacists to spread violence and hatred." Talk about who Sebastian Gorka is today, and also the calls, the expose by the Jewish Forward about his ties to far-right Nazi groups in Hungary.
Well, Sebastian Gorka has links to a Hungarian neo-Nazi organization called the Vitézi Rend. His father was a member, so the Daily Forward reported, and Sebastian Gorka actually wears his father's neo-Nazi sympathetic Vitézi Rend medal. Sebastian Gorka has worn it on many occasions in their photos. Sebastian Gorka says wearing this neo-Nazi medal is merely a tribute to his late father. I'm sorry, didn't Dad have a favorite tie? Really? I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't particularly wear my father's neo-Nazi medals.
And Steve Bannon.
Okay, Steve Bannon is beneath contempt. Here's the politics we have in the White House. President Trump is clearly afraid to fire Steve Bannon because President Trump probably wonders what hell Steve Bannon will cause out there. Steve Bannon's destroying the country. He's got to go.
Let me play what President Trump had to say about him, insisting that Steve Bannon is not a racist.
I like Mr. Bannon. He's a friend of mine. But Mr. Bannon came on very late. You know that. I went through 17 senators, governors, and I won all the primaries. Mr. Bannon came on very much later than that, and I like him. He's a good man. He is not a racist, I can tell you that. He's a good person. He actually gets a very unfair press in that regard. But we'll see what happens with Mr. Bannon. But he's a good person, and I think the press treats him, frankly, very unfairly.
Donald Trump talking about Steve Bannon.
Well, Donald Trump really is the expert on seeing whether somebody is racist. Give me a break. Come on. But, you know, I'm intrigued by that clip. We had Heather Heyer die on Saturday, and President Trump is talking about his alleged victory for president. How narcissistic can you get? What President Trump should have done in Trump Tower is be a leader, commune with our grief. And Amy, this isn't partisan, because we had every president of the last few generations knew how to commune with grief, not this president.
On Wednesday, neo-Nazi leader Richard Spencer spoke with Israeli media and compared his views to those held by Zionists. This is Spencer speaking to Channel 2 News, Israel.
As an Israeli citizen, someone who understands your identity, who has a sense of nationhood and peoplehood and the history and of an experience of the Jewish people, you should respect someone like me who has analogous feelings about whites. I mean, you could say that I am a white Zionist in the sense that I care about my people. I want us to have a secure homeland that's for us and ourselves. just like you want a secure homeland in Israel.
That is white supremacist Richard Spencer.
Well, I'm a proud Jew. I'm a proud supporter of Israel. I'm a proud supporter of a two-state solution for Israel living side by side with an independent Palestinian state together in love and cooperation. That is repulsive. Wherever you stand on the Middle East, I don't care if you're left, right, or center, what we just heard is repulsive. And President Trump is bad for the Israelis. He's bad for the Palestinians. Talk about an opportunity to unify us. That was exploitation. I want to throw up.
I want to end with David Duke speaking in Charlottesville, Virginia this weekend. The KKK leader said white nationalists are going to, quote, fulfill the promises of Donald Trump's presidency.
This represents a turning point for the people of this country. We are determined to take our country back. We're going to fulfill the promises of Donald Trump. That's what we believed in. That's why we voted for Donald Trump, because he said he's going to take our country back, and that's what we got to do.
Well, during the presidential campaign last year, then candidate Donald Trump came under fire for inciting his supporters to violence. Here's one example.
If you see somebody getting ready to throw a tomato, knock the crap out of them, would you? Seriously. Okay? Just knock the hell. I promise you, I will pay for the legal fees. I promise. I promise.
So that was President Trump then, and of course we see what he's saying today. Final comments, Richard Goldstein of the Anne Frank Center.
Stephen Goldstein, but I have a brother, Richard. I don't mind, but listen, how is Melania's cyberbullying campaign going? We see in that clip that there is almost no space, in fact none, between Donald Trump's rhetoric and David Duke's rhetoric. We have a rhetorical convergence between the hate speech of the President of the United States and, as we saw in that clip, David Duke. That's what America has become, and we can all weep.
Stephen Goldstein will leave it there, Executive Director of the Anne Frank Center for Mutual Respect. When we come back, part 2 of our conversation with a former white supremacist, as well as a nephew of a white supremacist who marched this weekend in Charlottesville. Stay with us. Your Racist Friend by The Specials, a.k.a. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Earlier this week, a remarkable letter was published in a local newspaper in Fargo, North Dakota. The letter was written by Pierce Teft about his son, Peter Teft, who was photographed attending Saturday's deadly white supremacist rally in Charlottesville. Pierce Teft wrote, "None of his beliefs were learned at home. We do not, never have, never will accept his twisted worldview. Peter once joked, the thing about us fascists is, it's not that we don't believe in freedom of speech. You can say whatever you want. We'll just throw you in an oven. Peter, you will have to shovel our bodies into the oven, too. Please, son, renounce the hate, accept and love all." Those are the words of Pierce Teft, the father of white supremacist Peter Teft, who marched in Charlottesville. Well, on Thursday on Democracy Now!, I spoke to another member of the family, Jacob Scott, Peter Teft's nephew. In addition to Jacob, we spoke with Christian Picciolini, co-founder of Life After Hate, a nonprofit helping people disengage from hate and violent extremism. He was a leading neo-Nazi skinhead gang member and far-right extremist in the 80s and 90s. Christian is the author of Romantic Violence, Memoirs of an American Skinhead. Today, we bring you part 2 of our conversation with these two men. I began by asking Jacob Scott in Fargo, North Dakota, what it means now that the family has come out publicly after his uncle was outed as one of the white supremacists at the rally in Charlottesville.
Thousands of people came when Yes, You're Racist outed him, and were flooding his Facebook page with comments and various denunciations. There was a little bit of friendly fire, so to speak. There were a few people amidst the thousands who were coming after other members of our family, and you know, some people have been trying to say that these anti-fascists are just as bad as the fascists, and they're employing the same tactics, but ultimately, I mean, considering the thousands of people that went after my uncle, it was really just a few bad apples that were attempting to harass certain members of my family. And there were other people who were suggesting that we only disowned him and we only publicly disowned him to save ourselves, so to speak, to absolve ourselves of guilt. But again, like, my cousin and I had been pushing for this for some time. We do not believe that a Nazi should be welcome in our family, and we long wanted him to be excluded from family events. We don't think that accepting a Nazi into the family, allowing a Nazi to go to our family events is a morally right thing to do. It condones Nazism. It says that it's okay for him to be a Nazi and that he'll still be welcomed into the family. And so we were very glad that we were finally able to get the rest of the family on board with this.
So I was wondering if Christian Picciolini could respond to Jacob. Christian Picciolini, the former neo-Nazi and co-founder of this group, Life After Hate. If you could talk about what you've just heard and how Jacob's family has now come out to also out his uncle, the white nationalist Peter Teft, who was part of the rally in Charlottesville. What do you think can be done in this case? I mean, you've been through this a lot now. People who, like yourself, were white supremacist and then started to change.
You know, I agree with Jacob that we have to hold people accountable for what they say and what they do. However, I don't agree with the tactic of public shaming or calling somebody out with the intention of pushing them further away. And I know that wasn't the intention. The intention was to try and make a statement so that Peter knew that his family cared about him and would welcome him back if he renounced his views. But what happens and why people join these types of movements is because they already feel ostracized, because they already feel marginalized and disenfranchised. And pushing him farther away and not giving him the support of a family structure, I fear will actually push him further into this movement, because he went searching for something. He went searching for a community or a family and an identity. And if the family, the real family he has, is pushing that away even further, the chances of him coming back because he feels remorse about what his family said are slim to none, in my opinion.
Jacob, if you could talk about what it would mean to welcome Peter back and any efforts you've made as he increasingly turned to white supremacy to reach out to him before this final disavowal.
Well, I understand what Mr. Picciolini is saying. In this, and I would agree with that in the general case, if a family out there has somebody who's starting to fall into the white supremacist kind of mind trap. But in Peter's individual case, I have to think that he's simply too far gone. He's, you know, I before the break, I was talking about how he's as a person, he's a bit unstable and a bit unhinged. You know, part of the reason why my cousin and I wanted to have him kind of formally disowned from the family, formally barred from family events, is because, frankly, we do fear him. And he, like I said, he gets very, very emotional very, very suddenly if he's even slightly flustered. And he's very muscular. He's very strong. And a lot of family members just don't feel safe around him. So while there is the consideration of, how best can we deal with him in such a way that he'll feel that he can still come back to us, there's also the consideration of, in the meantime, could he potentially hurt us? Would it be more healthy for us to make sure that he's not in our presence, at least until he on his own can find his way back?
Christian, any words of wisdom here? I mean, not only did you move away from white supremacy, the neo-Nazi movement, but in your group, if you could tell us stories, Life After Hate, of other people, and what are the most effective approaches through specific anecdotes and stories.
Sure. Well, our approach is to work with people in a compassionate and empathetic way, and to listen to what they have to say instead of arguing with them ideologically or pushing them further away. And what I listen for are these things that I call potholes. What existed in their path that deviated it. And then my job becomes to fill those potholes, whether it's job training or life coaching or tattoo removal or mental health therapy. And what happens inevitably is when people are more equipped, understand what they're dealing with internally, they don't necessarily need to blame somebody else for what they feel is being taken away from them, because now they're more resilient and they're more able to compete and they're more self-confident. However, I do challenge their ideology as well, but not by debating. What I do is I introduce them to people that they think that they hate. And I've introduced Holocaust deniers to Holocaust survivors, Islamophobes to imams and Muslim families to have family dinner. And it's those types of connections, those opportunities to humanize that really bring people back, because people join these groups because they're out searching for something that they're not getting in their real life.
I wanted to go to your uncle, Peter Teft, who recently spoke to the local station WDAY-TV in Fargo, North Dakota, where you too, Jacob, live. Peter defended the term fascist and said he doesn't blame his family for speaking against him publicly.
Fascism is just loving your family and doing what's best for your nation. I don't hold anything against them for what they had to say about me, because it's the safest thing to do in this political climate. Nazi is a racial slur towards white people.
Jacob, as you listen to him, your thoughts?
I mean, he says things like that. Fascism is about loving your family, and Nazi is a racial slur against white people. I mean, it's like he's so far gone down the rabbit hole that you can't even reach him to bring him back. Obviously, I hope that's not true, but ultimately, that's the case that we find ourselves in. I consider myself pretty far left. I consider myself a democratic socialist, and he's talked to me about how he and I and my people and his people should team up, because we're both fighting against the same establishment, the same globalists. And I say to him, you believe in racial separation. I believe in racial reparation. There's no similarity between us. And he and lots of Nazis think that they're fighting against the establishment, but racism is the establishment, I mean, capitalism is built on racism from the ground up. And so when you have this worldview that kind of looks at everything upside down and backwards, I don't know how to reach him and how to prevent him from doing the things that he says he's going to do.
Christian Picciolini, when you hear Peter speak, Jacob's uncle, what are your thoughts?
Well, from what I heard from the clip from Peter and what I heard from Jacob is that what Peter is saying is straight out of, the manual. He's repeating all the things that he's been taught. I want to just give the viewers a little bit of hope. And when Jacob says, he's too far gone, I don't believe that anybody is ever too far gone. I've worked with, grand dragons of the KKK who've been in for 40 years and recognized the error of their ways, and suddenly now realize, that's not what they want to do anymore, and that they've wasted, their lives. I myself have a very checkered past. When I was involved in the movement, I was invited to Libya by Muammar Gaddafi to receive money to start a revolution against the Jews. I committed acts of violence that nearly killed many people. I stockpiled weapons to prepare for what I believed was an inevitable race war. So, to that I would say, and I've worked with people in prison who've murdered people of color because of their racism. And while they were in prison, they found a way to disengage from that, which is probably the hardest environment to do that. So, just to give some hope, I've worked with some very tough people who, most people would never think would change, and it's really that compassion that you show them, because that's what's been lacking both within themselves and from the people around them as they get frustrated with their loved ones' beliefs. So what I would say to Jacob is, don't give up. If you care, and it's apparent that the family cares about Peter, otherwise they wouldn't have said the things that they did, but don't give up.
Jacob, did Peter text you after the Klan march on Friday night, the torch march, where hundreds of white supremacists marched through the University of Virginia campus, leading to one of the counter-protesters having a stroke as he was hit by these tiki torches in front of the Thomas Jefferson statue at the University of Virginia. But did he text you after the rallies on Friday and the attack on Saturday?
Yes, he actually texted me after I was on CNN yesterday. He was texting me, convinced that I was secretly on his side and that I was somehow helping him by giving publicity to this rally that he wanted to hold. I'm hoping that he's delusional about this and that he doesn't actually have the clout to be able to organize a rally, which may very well be the case. But if he holds his rally, he says he wants to hold it in October. And if that's the case, then we will hold our counter rally, and we hope that people would come to Fargo and help us, because we have a thriving progressive community here in Fargo, and I'm sure that there will be lots of people here who want to counter protest. But if Peter does have a large national profile, and it's seeming like he might be developing one because of this whole incident, he might be able to bring in, who knows how many Nazis, and they might be able to outnumber us the way we saw in some of the pictures from Charlottesville, where there were, just a small ring of counter-protesters and then just a sea of tiki torches around them. That's not a situation that I want to see here in Fargo. So if he does end up doing something, I would hope that we could get some people from outside of town to come and help us.
The leader of the Vanguard America neo-Nazi hate group that rallied in Charlottesville, Dylan Ulysses Hopper, was a Marine Corps recruiter. Now, this is very interesting. It's believed that this information led the Marine Commandant, the head of the Marines, to issue a statement. General Robert Neller, Marine Corps Commandant, tweeted, "No place for racial hatred or extremism in USMC," the U.S. Marine Corps. "Our core values of honor, courage, and commitment frame the way Marines live and act." And it wasn't only the Marine Commandant who tweeted, but it seems that almost every general of the Joint Chiefs of Staff have now made statements, and it may well be in part because of President Trump's unhinged, fiery, bellicose news conference that took place on Tuesday. I wanted to play for you part of what President Trump said on Tuesday about the deadly Charlottesville white supremacist rally.
Said there was hatred, there was violence on both sides.
Well, I do think there's blame. Yes, I think there's blame on both sides. You look at both sides. I think there's blame on both sides, and I have no doubt about it, and you don't have any doubt about it either. And if you reported it accurately, you would say.
Neo-Nazis started this. They showed up in Charlottesville to protest.
Excuse me, they didn't put themselves down as neo. And you had some very bad people in that group. But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
Very fine people. Christian Picciolini, co-founder of Life After Hate, the nonprofit that helps people get away from right-wing extremism, leave groups like the neo-Nazis, the Klan. What are your thoughts, the role that President Trump is playing? There are groups like the Anne Frank Center here in New York that say Twitter should close his account because he is inciting hatred and violence.
Well, I believe that Donald Trump is the Internet's biggest troll. I think his account should be shut down because, in the process of his rants and his daily tweets, maligning everybody from disabled people to women to people of color and supporting, organizations like the alt-right and retweeting white nationalists, this is not appropriate action for somebody who holds the largest and most powerful office in the world. The FBI published a report recently that showed that there is a massive amount of recruiting happening within the military and within law enforcement. And in fact, it was a concerted strategy of ours 30 years ago when I was involved in the movement, when we recognized that the shaved heads and the swastika flags and the Klan hoods were turning away the average American white racist that we could recruit, but they were too afraid to join because, of how edgy we were. So we decided at that point, 30 years ago, that we were not going to shave our heads. We were going to trade in our boots for suits. We were going to go enroll in college and recruit on campuses. We would get jobs in law enforcement, go into the military to get training and to be able to recruit there, and then even run for office. And here we are 30 years later with that dream or that nightmare realized. Now, they're wearing polos and khakis, and they blend in. They look like our doctors, our mechanics, our teachers, our nurses. And it's hard to distinguish them aside from the words that they say and the actions that they take, which oftentimes in public, when they're alone, they won't do. So I think that the movement now is much, much bigger than it is because it has become normalized. It's infected the average American who normally, would only say things like that behind closed doors or to people that they trusted, now feel very emboldened because of the words and the actions and the policies of the president, that they feel they have a commander-in-chief who gets them, who understands their ideology and is willing to stand up for them and fight for them. And at that press conference, in fact, that's what he did by equating both sides and saying that there were good people on both sides and not specifically calling out the alt-right. I should mention this. He denounced the KKK. He denounced neo-Nazis and white nationalists. But what he specifically left out was the alt-right. And then he later went on to defend them, saying, well, they had a permit and the other folks didn't. As far as I'm
talked about the alt-left, the other folks.
And talked about the alt. There is no alt-left. There are Americans and then there are Nazis. And let me just say, the people that didn't have a permit there, the people who were there to counter-protest the Nazis, well, the U.S. Constitution gave them a permit to do what they did, so they didn't need one. And as far as I'm concerned, that's one of our most important American values, is the ability to protest what we see as damaging to our core American values, which still, frankly, need a lot of work.
I want to turn to a new Trump tweet. He just wrote, "Sad to see the history and culture of our great country being ripped apart with the removal of our beautiful statues and monuments. You can't change history, but you can learn from it. Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, who's next? Washington, Jefferson, so foolish. Also, the beauty that is being taken out of our cities, towns, and parks will be greatly missed and never able to be comparably replaced." The words of the President of the United States, Christian Picciolini.
Yeah, let me just jump in. Let's take the statues down however we need to take them down. Let's put them in Confederate cemeteries so people who do genuinely believe in the heritage, even though I disagree with that, can still pay homage to their idols and to their family members who lost their lives in the Civil War. However, I think we need to replace those statues with civil rights heroes, true Americans who did give their lives to fight for justice and the American dream, and especially the Robert E. Lee statue that is in Charlottesville. I would propose that a statue goes up in its place to honor the 3 people who died that day, because those are true Americans. These are people that we need to look up to. These are the values that we hold dear as Americans, not politicians or military generals who promote war, who promote slavery, who own slaves. That's not what America's about anymore. We're moving forward, and we need to move forward with the values that we hold dear and that we want our children to be able to benefit from. So let's take them down and let's replace them with something that represents who we are and who we want to be.
That's Christian Picciolini, co-founder of Life After Hate, a nonprofit helping people disengage from hate and violent extremism. He was a leading neo-Nazi skinhead gang member and far-right extremist in the 80s and 90s. He's the author of Romantic Violence, Memoirs of an American Skinhead. We were also speaking with Jacob Scott, the nephew of Fargo, North Dakota native Peter Teft, a white supremacist who was part of the hate rally in Charlottesville this weekend. After Peter was outed by the Twitter account Yes, You're Racist, his father, Pierce Teft, wrote a letter published in the local paper, The Forum in Fargo, North Dakota, denouncing his son's actions. We'll link to that letter as well at DemocracyNow.org. To see part one of our conversation with Jacob and Christian, you can go to DemocracyNow.org, as well as our more than hour conversation with the two after the show yesterday. Go to our website. When we come back, the government is seeking the IP addresses of 1.3 million people who went to a counter-inauguration website, J20. We'll talk about it.
After the war, the Nazis vanished without a trace, but battalions of fascists still dream of a master race. The history books, they tell of their defeat in 45, but they all came out of the woodwork on the day the Nazi died. They say the prisoner of Spandau was a symbol of defeat. Was Hess remained in prison, then the fascists they were beat. So the promise of an Aryan world would never materialize. So why did they all come out of the woodwork on the day the Nazi died? The world is riddled with maggots, the maggots are getting fat. They're making a tasty meal of all the bosses and bureaucrats. They're taking over the boardrooms and they're fat and full of pride. And they all came out of the woodwork on the day the Nazi died. So if you meet with these historians, I'll tell you what to say. Tell them that the Nazis never really went away. They're out there burning houses down and peddling racism.
The Day the Nazi Died by Chumbawamba here on Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Justice Department is demanding web hosting provider DreamHost turn over 1.3 million visitor IP addresses of people who visited the website DisruptJ20.org, which was used to organize the protests against President Trump's inauguration. The Justice Department's also seeking names, addresses, telephone numbers, email addresses, and other information about the owners and subscribers of the website. More than 200 protesters were arrested during the Inauguration Day protests and are now facing decades in prison on trumped-up charges. For more, we go to Berkeley, California, where we're joined by Nate Cardozo, a senior staff attorney at Electronic Frontier Foundation. His group is assisting DreamHost in its opposition to the government's search warrant. Nate Cardozo, welcome to Democracy Now! First, explain what exactly the government is demanding.
Hi, Amy. Thanks for having me. So the government is demanding that DreamHost, which is a web hosting provider based in LA, turn over literally every record that it has regarding one of its customers, the site DisruptJ20.org. So that would be all of the billing information, which actually the government already has via subpoena that they issued back in January. It means all of the email that was ever sent or received from DisruptJ20.org. And most importantly, it means the IP addresses of everyone who ever visited the site, which apparently, according to DreamHost, is more than 1.3 million people, Americans and people around the world, including, of course, yours truly.
How unusual is this request?
We haven't seen it quite in this context before. We have seen the government make requests this broad, for instance, in the child pornography context, where actually visiting a website is at least arguably capable of being a crime. In terms of this context, where the speech hosted on DisruptJ20.org was inarguably perfectly legal, we haven't seen it before.
So talk about the website, who put it up, the point of it, and then how you are assisting DreamHost in fighting the government's request.
Well, DisruptJ20.org was and remains a place for people opposed to the policies of the Trump administration to organize and protest. It was set up sometime after the election, and it was focused, obviously, hence the name, on January 20th. There were protests in D.C. and around the country on the day of the inauguration. And Disrupt J20 was a place where folks could get together and share information about how, where, and why to protest the inauguration. The site owner is potentially someone who EFF, my organization based here in San Francisco, may end up representing. So I'm not going to go into there. But we've been helping DreamHost since they received this search warrant. The general counsel of DreamHost was frankly shocked at the overbreadth of this search warrant, and called us right away and said, is there a way for us to fight it? And we said, yeah, absolutely. DreamHost got paid outside counsel, so they didn't need us, because as a nonprofit we work pro bono and we generally don't represent companies who can afford outside counsel. DreamHost got great outside counsel, filed a motion in D.C. To set aside this search warrant, and it's my understanding, at least, that there will be a hearing today on the case.
So how did the government get such a wide-ranging search warrant?
Well, this is sort of a sad story about the American judiciary. The D.C. Superior Court judge who signed off on the search warrant is not young, and it's my speculation, my uninformed speculation here, that the judge who signed the search warrant didn't understand what he was signing off on. The search warrant itself puts all the juicy bits that the government is seeking in an attachment at the end, and in the places to be searched and things to be seized section of the search warrant, it just says records identified with disruptj20.org. If I'm a judge who doesn't know an IP log from a Yule log, I'm not going to understand the implications of what's actually being sought here. The government, of course, in its order to show cause against DreamHost for refusing to turn over, for thankfully refusing to turn over all of this data, the government says, this is standard, we do this all the time. That may be what they told the judge, even though it's patently false.
More than 200 protesters were arrested during the Inauguration Day protests, faced decades in prison. How does that relate to this demand and DreamHost fighting back?
Good question. So under the Fourth Amendment, in order for a search warrant to issue, there has to be probable cause to believe that a crime was committed and that the places to be searched or things to be seized will have evidence related to that crime. The government asserts that there were crimes committed on January 20th. There was some petty vandalism or whatever. The government is claiming, of course, felony rioting, which is another thing altogether. So the government's theory of the case, laughable as it is that everyone who visited disruptj20.org did so in order to plan a crime. That theory is simply wrong, right? The Fourth Amendment was ratified in large part to prevent the government from issuing general warrants, right? The founders were very concerned about fishing expeditions, about a warrant that says, let's collect everything, regardless of whether it's evidence of a crime or not, and sift through it. What essentially the government is doing here is they're doing the equivalent of going to a library and instead of saying, give us the name of this person who checked out this book on this day, they're telling the library, give us the name of everyone who's ever checked out a book at your library, because one person may have committed vandalism after checking out a book. That's ridiculous.
Very quickly, Nate Cardozo, I wanted to get the Electronic Freedom Foundation's response to the web hosting company GoDaddy recently severing ties with the neo-Nazi website The Daily Stormer after the site posted an article mocking Heather Heyer, the anti-racist protester who was killed. You have 5 seconds.
So We despise the sort of racist speech that Daily Stormer hosted, but we're very uncomfortable when infrastructure providers make the decision that I'm not allowed to read that speech. That does not seem like the proper role for a company like GoDaddy to take. The remedy for bad speech is more speech. It's not silencing the bad speaker.
I want to thank you for being with us of Electronic Frontier Foundation. That does it for our show. Democracy Now! Produced by a fantastic group of people. Mike Burke, Nina Guzder, Nimi Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gaddis-Diener. I'm Amy Goodman.